Since the COVID pandemic, many postings on blogs, Facebook, and YouTube reflect the feeling that because our institutions seem to be overwhelmed, it will be up to individuals to pull us through this. Yet, being in isolation, there seems to be so little an individual can do. Since most of us aren't writers or videographers, what sort of activism is possible when we are locked down? Or even as we emerge from our homes into masked, cautious societies? What can we do? One idea circulating through the internet is spiritual activism. This term will no doubt mean different things to different people, from a grandma humbly praying for her loved ones, to the evangelist feeling the call to share the gospel, to the Buddhist practitioner sitting in Tonglen meditation. But what might spiritual activism mean to a mystic? We could define a mystic as a person who realizes, as in experiences, the reality of the oneness, the interconnectedness of all life. This existential comprehension means that the mystic knows with certainty that he is just an insignificant drop among countless other insignificant drops, while at the same time she realizes that she is the ocean itself. For example, in terms of the coronavirus, a mystic may experience that beyond sensible precautions, there's absolutely nothing an insignificant drop can do about this disaster. Yet, being the ocean in which this pandemic rages, a meaningful personal response is not only called for, it's necessary. Also realizing that both of these statements are as untrue as they are true, the mystic sees that an action driven by either of these perspectives is doomed to succumb to its own contradiction. This is basically Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. We can see this in practical terms when, for example, just the decision to go on a diet makes you feel hungry, or when social protests engender backlash. Thus, to be meaningful, activism must be sourced from another level of consciousness, a level not limited by the dualism of the intellect. Sufis suggest that we call this level the heart. Careful to point out that this doesn't mean that vital muscle in the chest. They characterize the heart in various ways. For centuries, Sufi poets like Hafiz and Rumi have encouraged us to love radically and courageously. In that experience, they tell us, the heart is discovered. Contemporary teachers like Pir Elias Amadon suggest that the heart is revealed through the non-dual awareness at the center of being. For the mystic, this heart is the core reality and the only source of action which does not devolve into its own contradiction. Sourced in the heart, this way of action has several characteristics which fundamentally alter our notion of activism, its goal, its process, and its outcome. For the mystic, activism has no goal. Understanding that a personal point of view can only see in the direction it's looking, a mystic knows that whatever goal she might envision can only reflect a very limited subset of what is actually desirable or even possible. But because he also knows that coherent action requires a focal point, otherwise energy cannot be properly directed, he sets up a heuristic feedback loop, an internal mechanism of awareness through which the goal redefines itself as he goes along. Or stated in the simple terms Sufis prefer, thy will, not mine, becomes the underlying purpose of his activism. For some, this may seem like passive capitulation, the opposite of activism. But for the mystic, it intensifies commitment, clarifies the mind, and sharpens action. The process of the mystic is radically different from that of the social or political activist, because there is no other to be acting against or on behalf of. We could say that in this way, mystical activism is always local, intimately local, since in the living experience of oneness, everything is here, now. There is no local versus remote or local versus global. There are only degrees of locality or nested spheres of experience. The central locale of this activism is one's innermost being, the core consciousness of moment-by-moment experience. It is in that imaginal realm of thoughts and feelings out of which we constantly generate our worlds that mystical activism begins. The driving motive of that activism is not to fix anything, not to correct any misbehaviors, not to judge and chastise the inner voices one doesn't agree with. Rather, it is to understand, to integrate, to help all of our inner saints, demons, and bystanders recognize their common source and destination. Or we might say that the activism of the soul is simply the expansion of our capacity for love and compassion. You might understandably object at this point that, laudable as this activity might be, it is not activism. It yields no useful outcome, does not promote a better world. But if we see that the mystic lives in another reality, we might realize that the better world she breathes into being is not a world of peace, since the experience of peace is only possible as the alternative to conflict. It's not a world of plenty, since plenty can only be known if scarcity exists. Not a world of justice, which can only be upheld in the presence of injustice. Oh, she might very well work diligently and practically and effectively to help right the wrongs around her, but that is not the world she gives herself to. The mystical activist is primarily in the service of the nameless bliss we are in this very moment, the timeless beauty we perhaps may not yet have recognized.